Before I begin, I would like to thank the AAG and the AIG for sponsoring this seminar. Some of the work I'm going to discuss was done while I was contracted to the Geological Survey of Victoria, and I would like to acknowledge their support, as well as the support of many of my colleagues over the years. I'm going to talk about some work that's been ongoing for the last 15 years or so, on and off, mainly off, but occasionally with bursts of activity. And also Emily House, Sasha, John Huntington, who have helped a lot on the hyperspectral side of things. And then, of course, I've been able to have access to a lot of deposits and information from the local Victorian exploration and mining industry, which, of course, you may know has been doing it tough for about the last 10 years, but they've had a bit of a resurgence, and so I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of the work we've done in Victoria in the past in light of some of the new interest in Fosterville-style gold mineralization. So I'll start off talking a little bit about the regional setting in central Victoria, give you a conceptual alteration model, in other words, some cartoons, show you some visual alteration. It's interesting in central Victoria, when I arrived in the area back in the mid-90s, the general consensus was that there was no wall rock alteration associated with these gold deposits. And there had been a bit of work done. It was just starting to come out from La Trobe University to indicate that there was, and then we carried on from that. And then I'll look at some of the ways we might reveal that cryptic alteration before coming to a conclusion. So a lot of this is based on work I was involved in the 1990s and the late 2000s. The initial work was supported by Amara P478, and I probably shouldn't have put that number up if I known someone was going to mention they're up to P1200 and something. That dates not just the work, but me a little bit as well. And then subsequently I worked for the Geological Survey of Victoria on the Gold Undercover Initiative, and that involved looking at a lot more drill holes and bringing in some HYLOGGER analysis. But as I said already, the alteration had been recognized by a few people in Victoria, but it's generally considered to be cryptic. So a bit of a cartoon to explain why this is important. Particularly in Victoria, a lot of prospective ground is covered either by basalt or Murray Basin sediments. So if you're out there drilling, you want to know if you've gone through the cover and you've gone into some alteration. If you move off and you fall out of that alteration, you're obviously going in the wrong direction. So we don't want to go that way. We want to start to develop some mineralogical and geochemical vectors that are taking us towards where we want to be, which is over on a fairly narrow target. So these vein systems are fault-hosted, generally not more than a few meters thick or tens of meters thick. So anything we can do to increase the size of our target for undercover drilling is going to be of benefit. So we've been working on a bit of a conceptual alteration model over the years. Perhaps not entirely well represented by this cartoon, but you can see we have these overlapping alteration halos. Probably the biggest one is a ferroin carbonate halo, which could extend anywhere from hundreds to tens of meters out from the mineralized structure. A sericide zone, which is associated with a bleached appearance in the drill core, and has a characteristic shortwave infrared signature. And we can also characterize it with 4-acid or whole rock geochemistry. And then we'll have an interior or proximal sulfide zone, which actually can extend out quite some distance. One of the problems we've had doing a lot of this work is defining what the regional background is going to be, because most exploration companies tend not to drill out in complete moose pasture. So it was difficult to find material that had no evidence of mineralization or alteration associated with it. Now, in spite of that cartoon I showed you, I think it's important to have a realistic concept of what the alteration entails. It isn't pervasive. These deposits are structurally controlled, so fluid flow is structurally controlled. Therefore, you wouldn't necessarily expect the hydrothermal alteration to pervasively infiltrate all the rocks. And to illustrate that, I put up a histogram of the arsenic levels of samples of wall rock within 10 meters of mineralization from the goldfields. And you can see, while the majority of the samples do have elevated arsenic above what you would consider to be background levels, there are some samples within close proximity to mineralization that have background or quite low levels. And people get a little bit worried about that you could be very close to mineralization and get something that doesn't really show the alteration. But that's the nature of the beast. So we have to think about that in spite of the cartoon I just showed you. So what it looks like in terms of the carbonate alteration is we can have both vein carbonates and disseminated ferroin carbonate associated with the mineralization. So the tray on the left is from Fosterville. This ferroin carbonate is not evident when the core is originally drilled. It becomes apparent after the core is oxidized for 6 months or more. And then, of course, we often have proximal arsenopyrite layers. Very nice example here from Bendigo. Well, one way we can bring that ferroin carbonate staining out immediately when we drill the core is staining with potassium ferrocyanide solution. So here's an example of drill core before staining. And then after staining, you can see that's brought out the ferroin, probably a ferroin dolomite or an anchorite quite beautifully in the drill core. But in addition to that, even the wall rock, the sandstone wall rock, contains a lot of disseminated ferroin carbonate spotting. So we can see that there, a scale bar of about 1 millimeter. And that's come up quite well. And you can detect quite low levels of ferroin carbonate using staining, probably to below 1% with a bottle of potassium ferrocyanide and a hand lens. The other thing to point out on this close-up of a bit of drill core is that we also see disseminated pyrite overlapping with some of the ferroin carbonate alteration. Now, one of the things that we can look at in terms of the ferroin carbonates is not just the abundance or its presence to indicate proximity to mineralization. We can also infer its composition from geochemical data. If we do have carbonate analysis for the samples, we can plot there we go, I found my mouse again. We can plot the calcium to carbon molar ratio, and we can plot that against arsenic. In this case, I put arsenic to titanium. And you can see as the arsenic content is increasing, the carbonates are becoming less calcic, and we're moving into the stability fields of ferroin dolomite or siderite or magnesite. We've just heard about trace elements in pyrite around orogenic gold deposits. On the left, a backscattered image, and the lighter colored areas are arsenic-rich zones within that pyrite. And if you do microprobe analysis, although I don't know that anyone does microprobe analysis anymore these days, but we did back in the 90s, we probed these disseminated pyrite, and you can see the increasing trend with arsenic content in percent on the y-axis. You can see the increasing arsenic content of that pyrite as we get close to a mineralized zone. And once we're that close, we start to see arsenopyrite. One of the things we did early on was we looked at some semi-quantitative or quantitative XRD analysis, depending on who you talk to, just how quantitative it might be. And two examples here, Ballarat East and from Fosterville. And shown in the blue diamonds is the ferroan carbonates. So that's ferroan dolomite and siderite. Whoops. And the little white rectangles are the chlorite. And you can see at some point we have a crossover where the ferroan carbonates exceed the amount of chlorite. And we see that both at Fosterville and Ballarat East. So we can do a similar sort of thing to what some of the other speakers have indicated before. We can do a ratio of ferroan dolomite over chlorite. And you can see we can map that cryptic alteration out about 60 meters from the mineralized structure. And if we compare that to the gold analysis, we have a little bit of noise close to the structure at Ballarat East, but really nothing until we get right into the zone at Fosterville. Arsenic, this is whole rock arsenic now in the samples, performs a little bit better, and that arsenic is undoubtedly in that disseminated pyrite that we looked at previously. And the other point to make is we know that that pyrite is a hydrothermal because it has a characteristic sulfur isotope signature. So I'm going to show you a little bit more data from Ballarat East. As I said, we collected an array of samples on selected cross-sections across a variety of deposits in central Victoria. We then did select one drill hole from each of the goldfields we looked at for HYLOGGER analysis. So that's that drill hole shown in red. And in addition, and this goes back to the time where the HYLOGGER 3 was just being designed, we also did thermo-infrared analysis of that particular drill hole. Or I should say CSIRO did. So one of the things we see in a number of these deposits is a characteristic shift in white mica composition. So we've had a bit of background on that. And you can see, now I plotted arsenic on the x-axis as an indicator of proximity to mineralization. And then we've got that wavelength position on the y-axis. And we have a transition from phingite to muscovite. Also shown are the alteration assemblages for those samples. Now these are analysis of coarse crush splits from the hand samples that we did geochemistry on. So these are individual core samples. And plotted those up. We have a complexity at Ballarat East because kaolinite is part of the alteration assemblage associated with mineralization at Ballarat. And it may be affecting the peak position a little bit. I'll talk a little bit more about the kaolinite because we'll have a closer look at that when we look at the thermo-infrared data. But you can see we have a bit of a shift there, and I'll look at another deposit next. This is Fosterville. So in fact, a better response, going from chloride-bearing assemblages having low arsenic contents to a white mica carbonate assemblage in the pale blue as the arsenic content kicks up. So I think what we're seeing is we're seeing the development of ferroan carbonates at the expense of chlorite as we move in closer to the structures. This is Costerfield, starting off probably with a slightly different wavelength, characteristic wavelength, but again moving into that muscovite compositional area. And then of course there's always one in the family that doesn't behave, and that was Bendigo, which unfortunately is the biggest gold deposit in central Victoria. What we're seeing is overlap in the ALOH peak position regardless of the amount of mineralization, and we're also retaining chlorite as part of that alteration assemblage as we increase the arsenic content. The other issue we have is if we step back now and we look at surface samples, because of course if you're drilling through cover, the first thing you're going to intersect is going to be oxidized bedrock or saprolite, and so we wanted to have a look at whether we could pick out some of the geochemical and mineralogical signatures close to the mineralized areas. We're looking here at data from Fosterville, and I've shown in the red circle where the Fosterville Goldfield is located. And you can see, using the same wavelength to distinguish muscovite from fingite, we don't really see that fingite to muscovite transition as we get close to Fosterville. We are seeing a lot of muscovitic compositions. These samples will have a lot of supergene kaolinite in them, and there may be some interference affecting the position of that ALOH peak location. So we can pull this all together, and we can look at the geochemistry as well and integrate the two. And so the area in red here is just blowing up the plot on the right. Again, these are the sodium, aluminium, potassium, aluminium molar ratio plots we looked at earlier today. And you can see there is this trend down towards muscovite and complete loss of albite, particularly from the sandstones, but we're starting from different positions for the sandstone and the shale. One of the reasons I prefer to work with sandstones is because they do start off with detrital albite in them, and they're more useful for tracking that sodic loss and sericitic alteration compared to the shales. And they also tend to be a little more permeable and tend to fracture during deformation and open up a bit for fluids. So we'll quickly look at some, some HYLOGGER data before finishing up. So this is a summary of Ballarat, the Ballarat East drill hole. So the top summary is the relative abundance of iron carbonate. And you can see we have areas where the iron carbonate is kicking up, generally close to faults, and the faults with the indicated by the yellow dashed lines are mineralized. The ratio of white mica to chlorite is in part sensitive to changes in lithology, so we do have a lithological effect upon which we are superimposing the alteration. That's something always to keep in mind when you're looking at your mineralogy. The alteration mineralogy is always going to be a function of your starting material, and so you're superimposing on a variable background. So we do have some complexity in there, but in general, the ratio of white mica to chlorite increases near a fault structure. And then we have this transition from fingite, more of a background signature, to muscovite. And if we look at some of the thermal infrared data from the same drill hole, again, I mentioned this before, we're seeing kaolinite increase near faults and near mineralized structures. So here, and here. This has caused a lot of debate. These are quite deep drill holes. This one was drilled from underground, probably 300 or 400 meters depth. There was some suggestion or discussion about whether this was a deep supergene effect from circulating groundwaters. But if you think about it, if you start with chlorite and you destroy the chlorite and convert it to ferroin carbonates by adding CO2 to the rock, what you're going to be left with is aluminium and silica. And if we have a low potassium activity in the mineralizing fluid, we probably would end up with kaolinite rather than a white mica. So I think it could be hypogene, but I think more work needs to be done on that. The other thing we see from the thermal infrared is that the albite abundance is also decreased in those areas. So you can see when we get close to these mineralized structures, we're losing our detrital albite. And the quartz abundance is going up and the carbonate abundance is going up. So to summarize the short wave signatures for these deposits, again, now these summaries are derived from the HYLOGGER data. So I plotted the wavelength of the ALOH on the x-axis. You can see we have a good separation of Fosterville. Not too bad at Ballarat, and maybe a couple of populations. Costerfield, again, three modes in the data, but complete overlap of the white mica chlorite and white mica carbonate assemblages at Bendigo. So Bendigo, again, is not behaving very well. So in summary, we have a Ferroan carbonate halo around most central Victorian goldfields. I might point out we did look at Malden. I haven't put it in as a case study because it's been contact metamorphosed, and so we've lost the carbonate. I believe this Ferroan carbonate is forming at the expense of chlorite, which is probably a regional background mineral in the stratigraphy. We have an increase in white mica relative to chlorite and detritalapatite, which defines this overlapping sericite alteration halo. At least at Ballarat, Fosterville, and Costerfield, we have this characteristic shift from thengitic to white mica compositions to more muscovitic compositions, and we don't really see that at Bendigo or Castlemaine. And then we have an intersulfidic halo characterized distally by disseminated pyrite and proximally by disseminated arsenopyrite. Within that disseminated pyrite, we have some characteristic trace elements. So pulling all that together, I believe we can vector effectively within central Victoria. Thanks.